Hi everyone, so my name is Rachael Connally and I am a graduate student researcher at Texas A&M University in College Station. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that was conducted as part of my thesis research program. So today we'll talk a little bit about the human dimensions of wild pig management, and specifically we'll discuss a topology of wild pig hunters in Texas. So as we all know, wild pigs are widespread and destructive invasive species in the United States. Since they were introduced by Spanish settlers to the United States in the early 1500s, there have been subsequent introductions, including translocations of European wild boar for hunting purposes, as well as escape of free-ranging livestock from livestock management practices. Wild pigs continue to expand their range across the United States today. So here's a map from the 1980s, and here's a more recent map from 2018. As you can see, wild pigs cover nearly every county in the state of Texas. So as we all know, wild pigs can pose threats and risks to agricultural, ecological, and human health-related activities. So wild pigs can primarily cause agricultural damages to crops and fields through rooting and depleting stored commodities by foraging. Wild pigs can pose ecological risks by predating upon native wildlife and contaminating above ground waterways. And wild pigs can pose risks to human health through disease and parasite transmission, as well as more concrete risks such as vehicle-wildlife collisions. However, wild pigs also provide benefits as a resource for meat and recreational hunting opportunities, which allows for guided hunting and lease income among private landowners. Additionally, wild pigs can be culturally or regionally important in some areas of their invaded range. For example, in impoverished communities in South America, subsistence harvest of wild pigs replaces harvest of bushmeat, which would typically include native wildlife. So the issue of wild pigs in Texas offers an opportunity to investigate differences in management attitudes and costs and benefits associated with an invasive species across a large spatial distribution and among various stakeholder groups. Texas harbors the largest wild pig population in the United States, and because they're not regulated as a game animal in the state, the species provides a year-round resource for recreational hunting with no harvest limitations. As such, private hunting opportunities may incentivize the maintenance of a viable wild pig population and hinder efforts to manage damage caused by the species. Texas is comprised of over 95% privately owned lands, making it essential to involve stakeholders in attempts to make decisions about wild pig management. Differences in losses and benefits incurred by stakeholders in these wildlife management decisions can create potential for conflict, as different groups may value wild pigs differently due to their perceptions of risks and benefits associated with the species. In such cases, the selection of a management plan may be challenging and necessitate cooperation and mutual understanding between wildlife managers and various stakeholder groups. An optimal management plan for wild pigs must strive to strike a balance between the damages caused by the species and the revenue generated by maintaining populations for hunting use and market sale. So this study seeks to identify factors that influence participation in wild pig hunting activities to better understand wild pig hunters as an important stakeholder group that makes use of these wild pig populations in Texas. Specifically, we model participation in wild pig hunting using knowledge, attitude, demographic, and habitat-based factors. Existing research on stakeholder use and management of wild pigs is generally limited to AgriLife Extension Service educational seminar attendees and may not be representative of diverse publics within the state. So in order to create a more broadly acceptable wildlife management plan for wild pigs, we seek to apply our research to generate a greater amount of knowledge on wild pigs as a resource in the state of Texas. So to start this research, we first needed to develop a survey. So following Dillman's tailored design method, we developed a mixed mode survey instrument using Qualtrics online survey software. Then we were able to get a large sample of Texas licensed hunters from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So we were able to conduct a census sampling of email lists, so meaning that every individual who purchased a hunting license in Texas and provided their email at their point of purchase was contacted and invited to participate in the survey. And we were also able to conduct a random sampling of mailing addresses. So essentially what we did is we used a principal components analysis to understand the underlying factors behind hunter attitudes toward wild pigs. We then measured knowledge on wild pig biology, ecology, and management. And then we used the demographic, knowledge, and attitudinal-based variables that we had collected to create a binary logistic regression, and we used stepwise AIC procedures to identify the factors most important in predicting participation in wild pig hunting. So we contacted over 160,000 Texas licensed hunters, and we received over 37,000 total responses to the survey, giving us about a 22.9% response rate. About 93% of our respondents predictably reported hunting in Texas, and about 77% of Texas hunters hunted wild pigs. Approximately 50% of Texas wild pig hunters owned land in Texas, and about 93% of Texas hunters who hunted wild pigs hunted some other type of big game animal in the state. The average wild pig hunter was about 50 years old, male, white, held a bachelor's degree, and made over $100,000 in annual family income. We asked respondents to provide their residential zip code, and we used their zip code to identify the ecoregion of the state in which they resided. We had approximately even distribution of wild pig hunters throughout the state. However, in several ecoregions, we had substantially lower numbers of wild pig hunters who responded to the survey, namely the High Plains, the Rolling Plains, and the Trans-Pecos. And this may be due to differential densities of wild pigs in those ecoregions. Next, we asked hunters to indicate their preference for wild pig population numbers in Texas. Surprisingly, the large majority of individuals who hunted wild pigs in Texas indicated that they wished for wild pig populations to be reduced in the state. And only about 2% of wild pig hunters indicated that they wished for wild pig populations to be increased in the state. We then asked respondents to answer 10 true-false questions about wild pig biology, ecology, and management. We then graded these responses and created a knowledge score variable, which ranged from 0, meaning the respondent answered 0 questions correctly, to 10, meaning that the respondent answered 10 questions correctly. Wild pig hunters answered an average of 4 questions correctly. You can see here the questions at the top highlighted in green indicate that over 50% of respondents answered that question correctly. And the 6 questions below that highlighted in orange indicate that over 50% of respondents answered the question incorrectly. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of these questions and what that means later on. So next, we conducted a principal components analysis and selected the 3 factors which individually explained the largest percent of variance for further analysis. Combined, these 3 factors explained about 75% of the variance within the data. So each of these factors was found from 7 attitudinal-based questions on a 5-point Likert scale. So principal component 1 ended up representing broad attitudes towards wild pigs. Individuals who held high values for principal component 1 might say that wild pigs do belong in Texas, and overall their feelings about wild pigs are generally positive, but the harm caused by wild pigs does not outweigh any benefits of having them here. Principal component 2 represented the utilitarian value of wild pigs. Individuals who held high values for principal component 2 might agree that wild pigs overall increase their quality of life, and they are a valuable resource in the state. And individuals who had high values of principal component 3 would exemplify their tolerance of wild pigs. So these individuals might agree that wild pigs have the right to exist wherever they may occur, and that their harm caused by wild pigs does not outweigh any benefits of having them in the state. So we went ahead and collected all of those variables that I mentioned when we started out, and we tossed them into a binary logistic regression. We implemented some interaction terms where we thought might be important, and we went ahead and ran a stepwise AIC on that full model to identify factors which would be most important in predicting whether or not you participate in wild pig hunting in the state. We then calculated the odds ratios to interpret the effect of each variable on a hunter's likelihood to participate in wild pig hunting. And we ended up with a very large model which had a McFadden pseudo-R squared of 0.378, which indicates good fit. So we could spend a lot of time talking about all these different variables and what they mean, but I've decided to discuss 3 key findings that were particularly interesting as a result of this analysis. So firstly, we found that participation in other types of hunting was very important in whether or not you were going to be a wild pig hunter. So big game hunters were much more likely, about 13 times more likely than other hunters, to participate in wild pig hunting, as opposed to hunters who don't hunt any other type of big game animal. This finding suggests that wild pig hunting is an additive rather than compensatory activity among Texas licensed hunters. This may reflect the patterns that hunters use to hunt wild pigs. For example, wild pig hunters may harvest both native big game and invasive wild pigs in the same trip, especially if they're hunting in an area where wild pig densities are very high, and the opportunity to harvest a wild pig may be greater than the opportunity to harvest a native game animal. Additionally, wild pig hunting trips may be more opportunistic rather than intentional. For example, if you're out on your property and you happen to see wild pigs and you happen to be able to shoot them or harvest them at that moment in time, I think a lot of hunters would go ahead and do that. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. So we also found that hunters' knowledge on wild pigs was important in determining whether or not they would participate in wild pig hunting. Generally, as individuals held in higher knowledge of wild pigs, they had a higher likelihood of participating in wild pig hunting. Each correct response to a knowledge question about wild pigs increased the likelihood of hunting them by about 23%. However, these findings also elucidate a clear deficiency in knowledge on wild pig zoonotic disease risk, natural history, and legal regulation among licensed hunters. Most interestingly, only about 34% of hunters correctly reported that wild pigs can carry diseases that can be transmitted to humans. Wild pigs carry over 11 diseases that can be transmitted to humans, including brucellosis, hepatitis E, and trichinellosis. Thus, wild pig hunters may be at an increased risk for disease transmission due to this lack of knowledge. And so in the realm of human dimensions, we can improve our outreach and education to licensed hunters by informing them of these disease risks that wild pigs carry and providing suggestions for proper PPE that hunters can use when handling these animals. Additionally, hunters were largely unaware of legal regulations on harvest and movement of wild pigs. Only about 14% of hunters were aware that wild pigs are not considered game animals in Texas. Additionally, only 13% were aware of legal restrictions on live wild pig transportation, release, and holding in the state. Hunter misinformation regarding these regulations is problematic because it suggests that improper handling of live wild pigs may be prevalent among hunters who are not aware of these regulations, and this may contribute to the species' range expansion as hunters trap wild pigs and hold them in either unapproved facilities or end up releasing them on new properties so that the species is then allowed to invade areas where it hasn't yet been introduced. Finally, very few hunters correctly identified wild pigs as belonging to the same species as domestic pigs, which is very interesting, and it may provide some insight as to when invaded animals are actually considered to have become naturalized or native among the general public. So I think that further investigation into the different areas where wild pigs have invaded in Texas, and understanding how the folks who exist in these communities where they do encounter wild pigs understand them as either native or invasive species will be really important and interesting for the future of wild pig management. Additionally, only 10% of hunters correctly identified that wild pigs are not native to Texas. So this may prove problematic in management efforts where people view them as a native species and instead value them as wildlife instead of feral livestock species. So generally, hunter perceptions of wild pigs and their utilitarian values affected their likelihoods of hunting them. In general, hunters who held more positive perceptions of wild pigs and attribute utilitarian values to them are more likely to hunt them. Interestingly, though, hunters who own or manage land and do not identify utilitarian value associated with wild pigs are more likely to hunt them than those who do. Hunters who own or manage land may thus ascribe higher utilitarian value to wild pigs, or hunters who do not own or manage land may ascribe higher utilitarian value to wild pigs because they do not have the firsthand experience with the costly damage caused on landowners' properties. However, landowners or land managers may fail to identify these benefits associated with wild pigs due to greater losses suffered to wild pig damages. So these findings suggest that two types of wild pig hunters exist in Texas: recreational hunters and management hunters. So non-landowning hunters may hold higher utilitarian value for the pigs because the species benefits them and presents minimal observable risks. Therefore, non-landowning hunters may be more likely to hunt wild pigs for recreational purposes. Conversely, landowning hunters may be more likely to hunt wild pigs as a means of controlling their population or mitigating the damage that they experience on their properties. Because they perceive greater risks, they're unable to ascribe higher utilitarian value to these wild pigs. So we hope that these findings will be useful to wildlife managers interested in managing wild pigs in the context of recreational harvest. Ongoing research from the survey information includes an investigation into the motivations driving participation in wild pig hunting and how these motivations impact wild pig hunter take and effort. This research will allow wildlife managers and decision makers to better understand the dichotomy of wild pig use and management, and to make decisions that best protect the natural resource and still receive broad support from stakeholders. So we'd just like to say thank you to all of our partners here in this research effort, and to everybody in Texas who received the survey and was willing to participate, because we couldn't have conducted anything without receiving all of those responses. And so if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach me at my email address, and I will try to get back to you as quickly as possible.